and girls, welcome back to another episode of the Gabs. Here we are, waiting live outside of Bohemian Rhapsody for the advanced screening of The Crimes of Grindelwald. We are here about an hour before the movie starts, and there are already 1 million people waiting in line. Good to see you. As you can see, lots of people. I am the first one. I only was the first one here by about 5 minutes before the rest of the people joined in. Good to see you. So, let's talk about Wednesday Wisdom. If we can get away from the lights. Good to see you in the AK. So we are going to watch The Crimes of Grindelwald. Grindelwald! Looking forward to it. I was not a big Harry Potter fan, apart from my amazement at the level of character development that could be done by a single human being. But I am a big fan of Fantastic Beasts, I have to say. And if you want, you can see my review on YouTube about Fantastic Beasts at Gavsmate. Alrighty, so let's talk. Now, Wednesday Wisdom was an interesting one. We are now looking at living in the grey. This is a hard thing to do for the autist. Living in the grey. Knowing that the answer is unknowable. Thank you very much, True Faith. Thank you. This is a difficult thing. Now, let's talk. Identifying cheap fame and diagnosing a pain that you already have can sometimes make the pain much more bearable. And we're now talking about anxiety. So, one of the things, that I was suffering from was intense anxiety around certain legal issues and other stresses that are coming up. Unbelievable amount of stresses. And just knowing that a lot of the anxiety is related to that stress actually reduces the anxiety itself. In a similar way to if there's a pain in your arm, that pain could be that there's just a little bit of bruising, or they might have to cut your arm off. You don't actually know which one. It's making you anxious. Yeah, don't want to be too loud with all of the other Harry Potter fans. It's a lot of people here, man. It's crazy. Anyway, so knowing the difference can sometimes actually help with the anxiety. And that's one of the things to learn. So sometimes you can be comfortable with your anxiety if you know that some of it is there for legitimate reasons. Okay, so it's natural. Learning to accept that there is a natural anxiety around my current situation makes the anxiety more bearable in the same way. So there we go. Is that the female bathroom? No. It's funny, most people coming to watch this movie are female. Yeah, holy crap. Well, at least up here anyway, at the top of the line. Alright, let's look at the next one we want to talk about here. Now, short-term memory. My short-term memory and deficiency in prioritizing, that's actually quite a common theme amongst those on the autistic spectrum. I have to tell you guys, by the way, if you look at my Twitter feed, we made the papers. That is correct. We, the Gab fam, made the papers. It's quite an interesting feature article in the Bega District newspaper, weekly newspaper. And if you go to my Twitter feed at @autist, you can see a link to us on Twitter. Very exciting stuff. They did actually get something wrong, though, in the line. They said that I said that human beings are a collective species. I never said that. I said human beings are a cooperative species. But it goes to show you that even when you have a journalist who's on your side, they can still accidentally remember. And so meaning can get lost in entropy. Very interesting stuff. And so you will see that if you read that, it looks like I'm a communist, when actually that's not the case. They were not my words, I promise you. Alright, so let's move on. Now, with autism, one of the interesting commonalities amongst those on the spectrum is a disproportionate IQ distribution towards one section of the brain over the other. Now, it's quite fascinating because the doctor discovered that I tend to describe things extremely visually. Looks like we're not coming in yet. Alright. And yet, under various testing during the diagnosis of Savant 4 years ago, 4 years and 10 months ago, what they discovered was that my ability to visually process was extremely limited, in fact lower than most human beings on the planet. And that sort of didn't make sense. I'm like, what's going on? So it turns out, according to the doctor, there's an input and output processing ability with each of the senses. So it turns out that my ability to read visual imagery actually is quite limited. But once it's in the brain, my brain can remember it at almost a photographic level. And that's the difference, which explains quite a fair bit. It explains why, it explains a few different abilities that the savant can do, for example. So I can remember how French letters are pronounced, the exact way that they should be pronounced, and the combinations of letters that make certain vowels. Given also that French is quite predictable, which helps make it easier. And it also allows the ability to rotate mathematical figures in one's head. And it's also interesting because during the test, the IQ test of numbers, where they read numbers out, between 8 and 10 is what most people can do. The test allowed up to 12, but I think out of fun they took me up to 14 numbers. And what I was doing was rotating the numbers. I could see them and I was doing this. I was going and so as I was remembering the numbers, I was putting them into ascending and descending order of magnitude, but using my hands to rotate them so my brain is projecting them out in front of me. So that explains how visual memory can be powerful in the output mode but not in the input mode. And the input mode, of course, is where you can get things like facial recognition. That's a problem. Facial recognition is very difficult for the autist, but the autist, one thing that is consistent with being on the autistic spectrum is recognizing details. Let's have a look here. What did he say? Image manipulation. There was something else I had to say. I can't find it now. I can't remember. But there's an ability to recognize individual specific details that can be recorded and then manipulated and put out, into an output very quickly. And that's something that many autistic people apparently have the ability to do. So when I recognize facial expressions, what I do is I actually take a geometric simplified version of someone's face. So I take the smile and I call it a line on a 180-degree horizontal axis. And then if I see someone smile, I consider that 45 degrees, and they have to move with the eyes. And if they move parallel with the eyes at 45 degrees, that's a genuine smile. And I've learned to do that, but that is not something the neurotypical does. Neurotypical has more of an intuitive recognition of the general face, whereas the autistic has to take the specific details and then arrange those details in a way that they can map it onto past memories and then relay that. And that's why when I did the facial recognition test, I scored only half as well as a neurotypical, but way ahead of most people with autism, because the savant section of the brain allows me to remember those geometric features and overlap them with memories of the past and then convert that into what people are thinking or feeling, whether it's anger, sadness, the genuine smile versus the non-genuine smile, etc. All right. So let's keep going. Now, what happened was that my short-term memory and inability to prioritize, which is a classical autistic problem, actually has recently allowed me to generate a map. It's a mind map, thanks to a little bit of advice from people. I've been able to synergistically add all of these ideas together, like knowing, for example, that I can't prioritize, to create project maps. And I've built a little map on Excel. And what that does is it creates a 3D pie graph and a 2D donut graph, and it graphs all of my projects by importance. And then I worked out a tiny little algorithm that calculates that if I invest 2 hours on all my projects on a given day, based upon their level of importance, it automatically splits up that 2 hours into 36 minutes on this project, 27 minutes on another project, etc., etc. And then it compares it to how many minutes I actually spend to find out how important I actually believe the task was in practice, and to see the discrepancy between how much I thought it was worth versus how much it actually turned out to be. It looks like we won't be going in soon, I'm not sure. If we are, I might have to leave you and continue in a sec. But we'll see what's going on. Waiting for our advanced screening. So that mind map is really cool because it actually allows you to not get too anxious about how many things you might have to do and be overwhelmed. You can actually create little pieces of jigsaw puzzles in this big roadmap and then complete them one by one. And then as you have new tasks, you can actually add them to the map. So I've tweeted one of them at Gabversity, a very small section of one of the maps.
Hey guys, how you going?
1 second.
Unfortunately, I've talked to everyone down there too. There's been a delay with this movie. The file's been transferred to the projector. And it's going to start more closer to 9 o'clock. But we're going to go cut out the ads. So they're actually going to start about 15 minutes later than it was intended to. 9 o'clock's the estimate, but it could be as late as 10 past 9. Once you guys have seen it, we'll make an announcement and keep you guys updated. Sorry about that. Is everyone okay with that? Does anyone want to swap to another session or anything like this? Like another day, I mean?
No, we're waiting.
Yeah, I know.
We're so in on it.
Before, actually. It's never happened, but today it's happened, which is 2 cinemas. And everyone was like, I made a joke, you guys work for 10 hours, don't you? Like, yeah. Everyone's keen. But thanks for your understanding, guys.
Thank you.
Are we allowed to go in a bit early?
Yeah. So this movie's coming out in about 10 minutes' time. We'll give it a clean. Sit down. Exactly. Relax, exactly. And that time will be fast enough.
There you go, guys.
Thanks, guys.
There you go. Harry Potter advanced screening is slightly less advanced. We're waiting. Let's see how we go. Cool bananas. Alrighty. So moving on. What's the next thing we were talking about? So, what I actually figured out. Now, this might be quite simple. For some people who are good at planning, they'll know this already. But it actually seems counterintuitive to someone with a haphazard mind that can't prioritize correctly. But it's similar to this. If you enter a city you've never been to before, you might want to look at a map for 10 minutes. And then it saves you driving haphazardly around the city, getting stuck in cul-de-sacs and no through roads. And in that case, that's what I mean about all the projects that I'm doing. With the GoFundMe for the guy that lost his part of his face and his hands, part of his hands and all of his skin. So I'm going to do a GoFundMe for him. And the books and, all of the meetings at libraries and the interviews and, newspaper that are coming up and the, all of that type of stuff. And the Autism sled run. All of that together is actually put into a map so then you know what you have to do. You don't have to go to sleep and worry. Everything is in. You can create little sub-increments, and instead of, some people buy like a project application or a workflow, but I'm just building mine from Excel because then I can do it the way I want to do it. And I'll run it past you guys later on Twitter at Gabversity. You can see I released one of them. It's really small. That one's really basic, and I've expanded them since. So let's move on to the next part. Now, facial recognition is also slightly different to visual reading and memory because it requires an understanding of certain emotions. It's quite interesting because I learned facial recognition before I understood what the emotion was. I just knew that that's what people called that emotion. So that's when they're angry, and when they're angry, what they start to do is behave in a way that's unpredictable. But then you learn to predict it. You realize that they will say things that you have to remember to not take as literally true. And the problem with the autistic brain is that obviously you take it as literally true. So sometimes it's better to not talk to people when they're angry or you're angry. Otherwise, you'll take things literally, and with my memory, you'll never forget them. And so you won't be able to forgive someone. And so it's better to not engage. And that's one of the things I learned with anger management years and years ago. So, even if I'm 0.1% mad and it would take another hour to get furious, you just walk away, completely stop, because you don't want to get in that situation. Because it's an irreversible type of mistake. All right. Looking at a person's face requires effort. But once it is in my head, it is locked in for life. That's sort of the best way to describe the difference in IQ distribution between the ability for me to input visual memory and output visual memory. So once it's in there, right? And that's why, for example, when they were testing me years ago, they got me to close my eyes and tell them everything that was in the room, which was easy to do. Because my brain doesn't forget what it looked at. But looking at it takes longer than most people. So that's where you get that, what they call a savant tendency, where you have an extreme gift in one section of the brain, but the other rest of the brain just not really that crash hot. Okay. Now, that's what I was saying, synthesize detail. So people with autism are very good in general, or across the spectrum. It's a characteristic that's say consistent with being on the spectrum, of synthesizing detail. So my brain doesn't see a picture in general, it sees all of the little dots that make up a picture. It's hard to explain, but for example, right now my brain just counted that this girl picked her boyfriend's hair 3 times, and on the 4th time he moved his head away. So my brain sees all of that. It doesn't see people chatting, people having fun, which is what maybe a regular person sees. I don't know. I'm guessing that's what they see. And so I can see if someone has a nose ring or what type of shoes they wear and if they've done their nails. And I see all of that, but I don't see the whole picture in one go. Sort of like when someone looks at a rose, they might see a rose. I see the petals, something like that. The brain has to process every single one of those and then tell itself that it's looking at a rose. It's not an intuitive thing. And that's what makes it hard to live in the grey. See, the grey is something that is, for the autistic, very difficult because it's not specific. Hello, Louise. Good to see you, my dear. Your Majesty. Now, the grey is where most people live, and that's why people with autism, I think, struggle so much in life. It's not because there's anything wrong with them, it's because everyone else lives in the grey, and the autist lives with specific details that are either switched on or off. One of the things I had to learn to do, my dear friend, hello, T. Louise, is learn to split the grey into a huge amount of black and white variables. So what you do is you take a lot of variables and you then say that a situation is made up of a huge amount of variables. And ironically, what that actually did was allow me to pass PIRSE, or to compute more complicated type of scenarios where the regular human gets really upset and they can't talk about those scenarios. In most cases, not in all. And so if you look at the scope yesterday, we were talking about politics from a scientific method, and you can see how calmly we can take it apart piece by piece. And the irony is that that was because I had to struggle to learn to be with humans, that it actually gave me this extra power, which most people don't seem to need, and so they haven't developed that ability. It's quite interesting how that happened. All right, so it's a form of what was I going to say here? Learning how to live in the grey is a form of medication, and that is the Wednesday Wisdoms that I go and see my doctor for. And it is a beautiful form of medication that does not require physical drugs.